and this was just giving them ammunition where the president had temporarily confused and disarmed them. For that brief moment we held the moral high ground when the president reacted. But when other people got into the act, we lost the moral high ground. And Channel 4 was then able to take footage of very ugly conduct and even stupid conduct.
Yeah, because
to the rest of the world.
Because at the protests and these placards that were written in English being flashed out against these Channel 4 journalists, and when they questioned about, is there anyone here who has watched the videos or the documentaries that we were done, there was no one to really answer them.
And some of them didn't even, most of them didn't even speak English, so they could hardly have written those placards. And surely, I mean, people in charge should know. That demonstration could not have been done, spontaneously. Come on, who are we kidding? They should know that there's a battle of narratives out there, that image counts, and that this sort of demonstration was a slur on Sri Lanka and on the president at a time when we were taking over the chair of the Commonwealth, and when there was a huge campaign against us. I mean, it's a simple matter of behavior, how you behave. At the center of the event, conduct was perfect. Perfect. I was very pleased. I've been for so many of these things all over the world from the time I was a boy. And I must say, it was world class. From the usherettes to, of course, the superb dancers, the elephants, the drums, and everything was done brilliantly. But that's the mainstream. When you have an enemy who's looking for stuff against you,
you need to clean up the bigger picture.
You have to clean up the fringes as well. Otherwise the camera focuses on that, because they don't want to say anything nice about you anyway. So if you give them a chance, half a chance, that's what they're going to use. And that's what happened. That's what happened. So if you look at the coverage out there, then we didn't win, which is sad.
We're moving on to British Prime Minister David Cameron's visit. Now, for sure, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting drew in leaders from all over the country, but David Cameron actually, took the spotlight at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and more than the meeting per se, there was a lot of attention that was focused on him. And he arrived in Sri Lanka, and he also went to Jaffna, where he was met by lots of Tamils who had come out to share with him their grievances and their stories. What do you make up of his visit to Colombo, Doctor?
Well, I mean, it was clearly political. It was a political intervention. It was political theatre, but it also had substance. Now, he attempted to, he rocked the boat here. He was trying to wreck the summit. His behavior was rather boorish, if I may say so, because the way he refused the hospitality of the Sri Lankan state, it was not a friendly attitude from the get-go, from the time he turned up. It was adversarial and clearly preconceived. Now, having failed to wreck the summit, he popped across to Jaffna and gave certain signals that when we look back in a few years, we may see as a very dangerous turning point in our contemporary history. Because it's well documented that in the period of colonialism, there was a kind of a special relationship that the British colonial power had with Jaffna, with some minorities, for a very simple reason. The rebellions of 1818 and 1848 against the British came from the south. So there was a special relationship. David Cameron's visit seemed to indicate an attempt to renew that special relationship at the expense of the majority of the country. British colonialism in South Asia also has the track record of having divided India and Pakistan. They were unable to or chose not to do that in Ceylon. I think a large part of the credit goes to the sagacity of D.S. Saranayake, who managed to outmaneuver Tamil ultranationalism at that point and win over the British, but we lack that sagacity. Anyway, I couldn't help but wonder whether someday we will look back and see that Britain considered this unfinished business, and whether the trip to Jaffna and everything that happened was not picking up where they left off and commencing what they failed to do, that was to create a separate state for the minority of the north of Sri Lanka. It's almost as if he considered that there were two power centers, Colombo and Jaffna, which is not true. But it was a signal that sort of encouraged that view. I find that rather distressing, and maybe my imagination is running riot, but since I'm speaking this week on UN Palestine Day, I was brushing up my notes, and I couldn't help but remember that the carving out of the State of Israel was the fulfillment of a promise made by Lord Balfour, who was British, that there would be such a state created someday. So we've seen so many things in the last few years: Kosovo, South Sudan, the carving out of separate states under the auspices of Western hegemony. And in this South Asian context, this is Sri Lanka's ex-colonial power. I mean, we've got experience with these people. We know what they're like.
And many of the ministers in President Rajapaksa's cabinet said that, this is attempts to colonize Sri Lanka again. We're not a colony. We shouldn't listen to everything that Britain is saying to us.
Well, this was clearly neo-colonial behavior. But President Rajapaksa's ministers should also know that merely asserting that we are not a colony doesn't guarantee that we will be able to defend our sovereignty. That requires diplomacy, the grasp of international politics, and it also means we have to win a vote in Geneva.
And Doctor, do you think the government of Sri Lanka really foresaw that this was going to happen in Jaffna, that when David Cameron visited Jaffna, he would be met by these women on the street crying with pictures of their disappeared sons and husbands being portrayed or displayed for him to see? Do you think they saw this coming?
Well, yes and no. On the one hand, you have a paranoid kind of oversensitivity to what can happen in Jaffna. There are those in the apparatus, the state apparatus, who think that the slightest opening and then, Prabhakaran's ghost is going to rise from the grave. But they don't know what is necessary to prevent that. And it's not the iron fist. You can't use the iron fist anymore. I think that was proven because everybody's watching you. And if you do that, there are going to be consequences. Very serious ones. So, yes, they would have expected some kind of disturbance, but there was also an underestimation, because one of the reasons we are in this mess is that after we won the war, those who were in charge, and I don't necessarily mean President Rajapaksa, the managers, shall we say, of the war effort, felt that there's no more problem to resolve. I mean, when there were those saying, look, there is a political problem which requires a political solution, we won the war, but now we have to attend to the real roots of the problem. Where is the political solution? The answer, and this is in the newspapers of that time, is what problem? I mean, it's all over. We won the war. I mean, Prabhakaran was the only problem. Terrorism, there was no other problem but terrorism. And now we won, and well, we know what to do there. We know what's necessary. And we've got KP, and there was a complete underestimation, not only of the geopolitical weight of the global Tamil diaspora, but also, I must say, of the spirit of the Tamil people, and the Tamil people especially of Jaffna. That was not understood. There was no sensitivity or understanding or attempt to understand the emotions, the sense of dignity, the willingness to stand up of the people of Jaffna. So there was an overestimation from a security point of view. We can't permit this, we mustn't permit that. But there was an underestimation of the global influence and the political capacity, which we have now seen from Ontario to London, to Washington, to Chennai, and therefore Delhi. We are seeing
and I think
that, and that was completely underestimated.
And British Prime Minister David Cameron's visit to Sri Lanka put that in perspective. When he was in India, he said that Britain shares the same view as Canada and India regarding Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And do you see him as a sort of a spokesperson for these countries? They didn't come, but he came and really stood his ground and said Britain would use its position in the UN Human Rights Council to call for an international investigation into Sri Lanka's war crimes.
Yeah. Well, he would like to think that he speaks for them all. I think that there is certainly a degree of political coordination. I mean, this is not accidental. Britain and the United States are the closest of allies. And there's conversation all the time. The US and India, the US, Britain and India, South Africa, and someday there will even be conversation with Russia and China about Sri Lanka. And it will come as a surprise to Sri Lanka. But that's the way the big boys work. Now, this does not mean, though, that Sri Lanka cannot neutralize or win back India. It does not mean that we can't turn this around. What it does mean is that we can't turn it around by remaining as we are. Right now we are sitting ducks. Because yes, as Cameron says, there is a convergence. Canada, the United States, which he didn't mention because it wasn't a Commonwealth context, it's outside of the Commonwealth. But the United States, Canada, Britain, and to a lesser degree, India. And there is a convergence of these very powerful forces. Right now, we are sitting duck. It's one thing to remain firm based on your principles. It's another thing to be a sitting duck or an ostrich with one's head buried in the sand. I'm afraid we are now somewhere between an ostrich and a sitting duck.
And for most of the questions that were raised to Sri Lanka about its what it's been doing after the war, the LLRC, or the Lessons Learnt and Reconciliation Commission, was the answer, given not only by the President but by the cabinet ministers, who also convened media briefings, media spokesperson Kelly Rambukwala, Minister Nimalsari Paulo de Silva. Then we also saw the Sri Lankan High Commissioner to Britain, Dr. Chris Nonis. They all said Sri Lanka has its own domestic mechanism, the Lessons Learnt and Reconciliation Commission. And I think Sri Lanka has wise people to deal with its own matters. This was the answer that was given repeatedly to these allegations or these questions that were raised.
Not adequate, because let me focus on the fundamental. The fundamental thing is this.